A 10-year-old girl vanishes on her way home from school. Police are searching, but so is the most feared mafia boss in the city. To him, child predators are the only unforgivable crime. Tonight, his entire criminal empire has one mission: find the girl and make her kidnappers disappear. Emma Hayes walked out of the school gates with the red backpack snug against her shoulders, its familiar weight a steady reminder of ordinary things. The zipper with its tiny silver star tapped lightly as she moved, keeping time with the scuffed toes of her sneakers. Inside the backpack lay a half-finished mystery novel, a sketchbook filled with clumsy drawings of animals, a crumpled test paper with a good grade, and the usual pencils and crumbs collected by a child who never fully cleaned out her bag. The afternoon sun pressed down on the city, bouncing off windows and windshields, turning the air into shimmering waves. She followed the same route she always took, past the iron fence of the playground, along the sidewalk where younger children still shouted and chased one another, then toward the main road where the bakery smell drifted like a promise. The crowd of students thinned as they peeled off toward bus stops or side streets. Emma hummed under her breath, not thinking of anything important, counting the steps between cracks in the pavement just to see if she could land exactly on each one. She knew this walk. Her parents knew it too. They trusted its routine and the way the city, for a few blocks at least, seemed manageable. Cars pushed along the street with the usual mix of impatience and boredom. A bus huffed at the corner, a cyclist swerved around a double-parked truck, and a delivery driver balanced a stack of boxes taller than his own head. No one paid much attention to a small girl with a red backpack. She was part of the normal background, one more piece in the daily pattern. Halfway down the block, a dark sedan sat at the curb, engine running quietly. Its windows were tinted, hiding the driver's face. A man leaned against the passenger door, his clothes neat but unremarkable, head slightly bowed as if he were checking his phone. Sunglasses covered his eyes. To anyone watching from afar, he seemed like another commuter waiting for a ride, another nameless adult in the blur of the city. Emma did not slow down when she walked past the car. She was thinking about the bakery and the possibility of chocolate cookies, and about the way her mother might smile if she brought home the good test paper. The baguette smell from the open bakery door floated toward her, mixing with the faint stink of exhaust. Around her, adult lives continued, eyes fixed on screens, ears wrapped in headphones, thoughts far from the small figure weaving through the noise. The man pushed away from the car when she came level with the alley beside the convenience store. His movements were easy and casual, as if he had all the time in the world. He stepped in closer at the same moment a delivery truck rattled past, blocking the view from the street. A shadow fell over Emma's shoulder. A gloved hand clamped around her upper arm, fingers digging into the thin fabric of her sleeve. Another hand pressed a cloth over her mouth and nose, rough and sudden. Her body reacted before her mind. Muscles tensed, lungs tried to pull in air and found only a sour, chemical sting. Her voice rose inside her chest but could not escape. She kicked backward, caught nothing, clawed at the hand on her face. The red backpack jerked sideways, one strap sliding down her arm. The man lifted her with practiced strength, turning toward the alley so quickly that her sneakers barely scraped the ground. In the narrow space between two brick walls, the air felt different, cooler, and stale. A second figure waited there, glancing nervously toward the street. The open rear door of the sedan yawned like a dark mouth. The second man reached out to help, muttering under his breath, his eyes flickering over the girl's small frame and the slipping backpack. Emma's vision blurred at the edges, the world shrank to the pounding of her heartbeat and the strange heaviness creeping into her limbs. The red backpack slid completely off her shoulder and dropped into a shallow puddle near the dumpster, sending up a faint splash. The silver star on the zipper caught a flash of light and then vanished beneath the ripple. One of the men glanced down, hesitated for half a second, and then looked up at the security camera bolted to the store wall. His jaw tightened. He left the bag where it was, shoving his partner toward the car with renewed urgency. In a few seconds it was over. The sedan's door slammed shut. The vehicle reversed smoothly out of the alley and merged into the slow river of traffic. The sun glinted on its roof as it disappeared down the street, as ordinary to the outside eye as any other commuter car. No one on the sidewalk noticed the space where a small figure with a red backpack used to be. The alley grew quiet again. A fly buzzed over the puddle. Water seeped into the fabric of the backpack, darkening the red and curling the corners of the papers inside. The city swallowed the moment whole and moved on. At home, minutes later, the familiar rhythm of the Hayes apartment began to falter. Emma's mother checked the clock and frowned. The usual arrival time passed, then the margin she allowed for traffic and dawdling. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, opened the door to look down the hallway, and saw nothing but the closed doors of other families and the distant echo of a television. Back in the kitchen, she picked up her phone and told herself that she would not be the kind of parent who panicked at every delay. Another 10 minutes passed. She called the school, listened to the hold music, and felt her pulse beat in her throat. The staff confirmed that Emma had left on time, that she had been cheerful, that nothing unusual had happened. Her mother thanked them and hung up with fingers that did not quite feel like her own. She called a friend whose apartment was on the route. No one had seen the girl in the red backpack. When Emma's father came home from work, he found his wife moving restlessly between the window and the table, eyes red from rubbing. The explanation poured out of her in fragments: the time, the phone calls, the lack of answers. Together they tried again, calling parents of classmates and the small bakery down the street. Each person on the other end of the line offered sympathy and confusion but no useful detail. The good test paper remained folded in the red backpack, forgotten in a puddle behind a convenience store, while the word missing crept uninvited into every thought. As the sky dimmed, the teenager working at the convenience store opened the back door to take out the trash. The alley smelled of damp concrete and rotting fruit. He lifted the bins, dragged them toward the dumpster, and then saw the red shape lying half in and half out of the water. At first, he thought it was just another piece of discarded clothing. Then he recognized the silver star on the zipper and the size of the bag. He had seen that backpack bouncing past the store window many afternoons, attached to the same small figure striding along the sidewalk with determined steps. Unease prickled at the back of his neck. He picked up the backpack by one strap, grimacing at the wet weight, and carried it inside. The front pocket sagged, dripping onto the floor. He opened the flap and carefully moved aside the soggy book and the scattered pencils. The ink on the test paper had begun to bleed, but a name stood out clearly on a label sewn into the lining. It told him who had lost this bag. It also told him something else, something heavier. He hesitated only a moment before reaching for his phone. The first police car arrived with its lights spinning silently, painting the alley in shifting blue and red reflections. Officers stretched bright tape across the entrance and moved with grim, efficient gestures. They photographed the backpack, bagged it, measured distances that, to the untrained eye, meant nothing yet. The teenager answered questions in a voice that shook. He kept seeing the backpack as it had been earlier that week, bobbing past his window, and could not shake the feeling that the alley itself had become hostile. Within an hour, the first local news site posted a brief notice online: a child, 10 years old, last seen leaving school, red backpack found abandoned. Neighbors leaned over railings to talk, shopkeepers shared what little they knew, and someone switched on the television in a bar where the sound of sports commentary was replaced by the more serious tone of a reporter. The city, always hungry for stories, began folding this one into its vast collection of tragedies and rumors. In living rooms and kitchens, people glanced at the photo of a smiling girl with straight hair and bright eyes, some with only passing concern, others with a tightening in their chest. Somewhere, in a high-rise building far above the crowded streets, another television showed the same image. It flickered across the screen of a private office where decisions were made that never appeared in official reports. Behind a wide desk of dark wood, a man glanced up from a stack of papers and let his gaze rest on the photograph of Emma Hayes and her missing red backpack, not yet knowing that his night, and her fate, were about to become tangled. Victor Kane was not used to having his attention pulled by the evening news. Most nights he let it play in the background like an audio map of his territory, noting which crimes were being blamed on which nameless suspects, which politicians were pretending the city was under control, which businesses appeared on the screen with their signs carefully framed. The stories that shaped the public view of his world rarely matched the reality he knew from the inside. He watched nonetheless, not for truth but for patterns. His office sat at the top of a tower of glass and steel, high enough that the city lights looked like a scattered constellation beneath him. Thick rugs dulled the sound of footsteps, and the air smelled faintly of leather and expensive liquor. The walls held no family photographs, only abstract paintings and a map of the city with certain neighborhoods marked in thin red ink. It was the map he truly cared about. Each line represented routes of money, influence, and fear that spread outward from him like veins. On this evening, he stood beside the window, one hand resting loosely in his pocket, while the television mounted on the opposite wall ran through its cycle of headlines. There were reports about a council meeting, a fire in a warehouse he already knew had been deliberate, a traffic accident on the highway. None of it moved him. His mind was on other matters, a shipment arriving at the docks, a troublesome lieutenant who had grown careless, a payoff that needed adjusting. Then the screen changed. The usual graphics gave way to the close-up of a child's face, smiling at the camera. The image was bright and clear, contrasting sharply with the polished darkness of his office. Underneath the photograph, a name scrolled slowly. 10 years old. Last seen leaving school. Wearing a red backpack. Something in the details caught and held him. It might have been the backpack, improbably vivid against the washed-out background of the school portrait. It might have been the fact that the news anchor's carefully trained voice wavered almost, but not quite, on the word missing. Or it might have been something deeper, an old memory stirred from where he tried to keep it buried, the image of another child in another city, left unprotected while adults looked away. He crossed the room and raised the volume. The reporter's words clung to the familiar structure of such stories. A girl named Emma Hayes had not come home from school. Her belongings had been found behind a convenience store. Authorities were asking anyone who had seen her to contact the police. They emphasized that time was important. The broadcast showed a brief clip of the alley, the yellow tape, the patrol cars, and finally the red backpack being carried carefully into a vehicle. Victor watched the bag disappear from the frame and felt a heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with anger about business or territorial disputes. He had long ago accepted that he moved in a world built on cruelty and selfishness. He ordered violence when it suited him, collected debts from people who could not afford to pay, and made sure witnesses forgot details that might later matter. Yet even within that world, there were lines he did not allow anyone around him to cross. Children belonged on the safe side of those lines. Anyone who tried to drag them into the darkness earned his particular attention. He turned away from the television and pressed a button on the intercom. A door opened almost immediately. His chief lieutenant, a compact man named Rocco, stepped in with the alert posture of someone who understood the dangers of being late. He began to speak about the schedule for the night, but fell silent when he saw the look in Victor's eyes and the image still glowing on the screen. Victor did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He gave instructions in measured, simple terms, each phrase carrying the weight of an unspoken threat. Every contact, every informant, every piece of the network that made his organization powerful would be redirected for one purpose. The docks, the clubs, the illegal gambling rooms and backroom deals would, for one night, become secondary. The priority was the missing girl with the red backpack. Rocco listened, nodded once, and left to set the machine in motion. Information moved quickly when pushed through the channels Victor controlled. Street kids who sold minor contraband were told to keep their eyes open and their ears sharper than usual. Drivers who ferried people around the city under the radar were ordered to report any suspicious cargo. Club managers quietly questioned patrons who dealt in gossip as much as drugs. Some did not understand why their boss cared about a single missing child. They did not need to. The message was simple: this mattered to him, and therefore it mattered. Across the river, in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, a woman known as a reliable hacker received a call she could not ignore. She pushed aside her dinner, cracked her knuckles, and began sifting through traffic camera feeds and dark corners of the internet where criminals sometimes bragged when they should have stayed quiet. In a different neighborhood, two off-duty officers who owed their comfortable lifestyles to Victor's generosity sat down together, closed the door, and looked again at the official reports they had received that afternoon. They were not being asked to corrupt the investigation this time, they were being pushed, firmly, to accelerate it. Victor moved through his office like a storm contained within four walls. His mind broke the city into blocks and routes, weighing possibilities. A child taken in broad daylight, without witnesses willing to step forward, suggested professionals or at least men who had rehearsed their roles. The abandoned backpack, so close to busy shops, implied haste. He considered the kinds of people who might take a risk like that. Some would aim for ransom, hoping for quick money and assuming the authorities would treat them carefully as long as the victim remained alive. Others might have darker reasons. The second possibility made his jaw tighten. He remembered a time, years ago, when he had first taken control of a small stretch of territory from a rival gang. Among the many ugly things he had found in the files and businesses he inherited was evidence of a ring that targeted runaways and foster kids. He had broken it apart with a level of fury that surprised even his closest associates. The memory of what he had seen in those rooms remained one of the few things that could still wake him in the middle of the night, hands clenched, with the taste of metal on his tongue. He had told himself that he had eliminated that kind of activity from his domain. He had made examples of those who tested him. He had the scars and enemies to prove it. Yet the photograph on the television and the story playing on the news felt like a challenge. Someone, somewhere in his city, had grabbed a child in broad daylight and disappeared with her. If they were stupid, he would crush them quickly. If they were clever, then the hunt would be longer and more satisfying. Either way, he refused to leave the matter solely in the hands of a system that moved too slowly for his taste. While his people began reaching out across the neighborhoods, the official investigation followed its own path. Detectives arrived at the Hayes apartment, notebooks ready. They asked for recent photographs and items carrying Emma's scent. They walked the route she usually took home, retracing steps that, on this day, had led into an absence. Witnesses were interviewed, cameras checked, timelines drawn on white boards in a precinct that already felt the pressure of the ticking clock. By late evening, the first full news segment aired. Anchors repeated details, experts reminded viewers of the crucial first 24 hours, and social media filled with the girl's image and messages of sympathy. In a bar near the docks, a regular customer stared at the television above the counter, his drink forgotten. He squinted at the grainy footage of the alley, trying to match it to his own recollection of that afternoon. He had been smoking in a doorway when he saw a dark sedan pull out of that very alley at an odd angle, just as a delivery truck passed. He had not thought much of it at the time. Now the memory nagged at him. He glanced around the bar. Two men in suits he recognized as belonging to Victor's organization stood near the back, talking quietly. The customer hesitated, then approached them, heart pounding. He did not know yet that the piece of information he carried would soon travel upward through the layers of the underworld until it reached the man in the tower who had decided that, tonight, a small girl's safety mattered more than profit. In his office, Victor watched the city lights flicker and intensify as full darkness fell. The photograph of Emma Hayes remained on the screen, repeated between commercials and other stories. He felt no tenderness when he looked at her face, only a hardening of resolve. Somewhere, she was trapped in a space chosen by men who believed they could act without consequence. They were wrong. The city belonged to many people in theory. In practice, large parts of it answered to him. Night rearranged the city, drawing certain people out of hiding and pushing others behind locked doors. For Victor Kane, darkness was an ally rather than a threat. It made secrets easier to hide but also easier to uncover when one knew where to look. His orders ran like an electric current through the invisible wiring of his network, and the city began to respond. On the streets, the first wave of information came from those who lived closest to the edges. Children who sold cigarettes and phone chargers near bus stops noticed unmarked cars that did not belong to regulars. They noticed nervous adults who passed by twice in the same hour, or men who watched the flow of pedestrians with too much interest. Taxi drivers and rideshare hustlers, whose eyes were trained to read faces in their rearview mirrors, recalled passengers who had asked to be dropped near discreet entrances, underground garages, or quiet side streets. Some details were useless, but others had weight. In a cramped back room behind a nightclub, a man known for arranging introductions between criminals and buyers typed furiously on his phone. The message he had received carried a tone he could not ignore. Any whisper about a child taken off the street was to be forwarded at once. He scrolled through his recent calls and paused on a number from earlier that week. It belonged to a low-level thug who bragged too much when drunk and who had, once, mentioned quick money connected to the sale of something more valuable than drugs or jewelry. At the time, the broker had dismissed it as empty boasting. Now he reconsidered. Far above these scattered figures, in her small apartment, the hacker everyone called Mira sat multiple screens flickering with lines of code and overlapping video feeds. She tapped into traffic cameras in the area where the backpack had been found, following the timeline backward and forward in short bursts. She watched pedestrians blur into streaks as she sped the footage, then slowed it again when something caught her eye. A dark sedan exiting the alley at a sharp angle, partly concealed by a passing truck. The plates obscured by glare. The driver's face hidden. She isolated the frames, enhanced the image as much as limited resolution allowed, and noted the shape of the vehicle, the position of a dent near the rear bumper, the aftermarket tint on the windows. She cross-referenced this with city databases she was never meant to see, compiling a list of similar vehicles registered in the surrounding neighborhoods. It was a long list. She narrowed it by eliminating those with no recent activity, then those belonging to people who would never be involved in this kind of crime. The remaining names formed a shorter, darker column. Some were already known to Victor's organization. Some were unknown, which was, in many ways, worse. She sent the trimmed data set to Rocco with a note indicating the alley and the time frame. Within minutes, the information was broken apart again and scattered to the men entrusted with following up leads on the ground. While the city's underbelly stirred, Emma Hayes lay on a thin mattress in a room with no windows. The air smelled of stale sweat and cleaning chemicals that barely masked deeper odors. Her head throbbed in dull pulses from whatever had been pressed over her face earlier. Time had become slippery, she could not tell how long had passed since the sidewalk, the alley, the sudden heaviness. She remembered the sensation of the car seat against her cheek, the hum of the engine, the pressure of a hand on her shoulder whenever she tried to move too much. Now, conscious again, she stared at the ceiling, tracing tiny cracks in the paint as if they might form some pattern she could use. A single bulb hung overhead, casting a weak pool of light that left the corners of the room in shadow. Her red backpack was not with her. That absence felt almost as shocking as everything else. It was as if a part of her life had been sliced away. Fear sat in her chest like a stone. When she tried to breathe deeply, it barely shifted. She thought of her mother in the kitchen, of her father coming home from work, of the way they would look at the clock and then at each other. The thought cut so sharply that she had to press her hands flat against the mattress to keep from shaking. She bit down on any sound that tried to rise. She did not want the men in the next room to know she was awake. Their voices drifted through the thin door in low, indistinct tones, rising occasionally in irritation. Although she could not make out every word, the rhythm told her they were arguing. She caught phrases about money, about police, about time. At one point, a chair scraped harshly against the floor outside, followed by a heavy thud. One of them cursed, feet pacing back and forth. Another muttered something about a buyer waiting and not wanting complications. Emma did not understand all of it, but she knew enough from television and overheard adult conversations to grasp that she had become something to be traded. The realization made the room tilt for a moment. She stared harder at the cracks on the ceiling and tried to ground herself in small details, the texture of the blanket against her palms, the faint ticking of a pipe somewhere behind the wall, the small patch of darker paint near the doorframe. In another part of the city, the official investigation reached similar conclusions but with less clarity. Detectives followed the standard steps, canvassing the neighborhood, reviewing school records, checking family backgrounds for enemies or custody battles. They interviewed witnesses who claimed to remember every detail and those who remembered almost nothing. The teenager from the convenience store repeated his story until the words felt detached from meaning. Each new piece of information was slotted into a timeline on the whiteboard, but the lines remained full of gaps. Some of those gaps were quietly filled by the officers who had met with Victor's men. They passed along details they could not easily obtain through official channels and received, in return, hints about places and people worth inspecting more closely. It was a delicate dance, one that balanced duty and compromise. Their consciences might have pricked them later. For now, they thought about the photograph of a 10-year-old girl and decided that cooperating with a criminal controller of half the city was preferable to watching the case stall. By midnight, the web of connections had tightened. The bar customer who remembered the dark sedan had given a rough description and the time he had seen it. Myra's footage supported his memory. The name from the nightclub broker's contact list, once passed through Victor's mental filter of grudges and histories, stirred a faint recognition. The man in question, a small-time criminal named Costa, had once worked as muscle for a more established gang. Rumors had followed him about cruel hobbies and poor impulse control. Victor had never trusted him, he had also never considered him important enough to eliminate. Now that calculation shifted. Rocco received instructions to locate Costa without involving police. The request rippled outward. Someone remembered a cousin who played cards with him on weekends. Someone else had seen him entering a particular apartment building not far from a major intersection. An informant who owed his continued breathing privileges to Victor recalled that Costa had recently bragged about access to a safe place where no one asked questions, owned by people in suits rather than leather jackets. The picture that emerged was messy but pointed in the same direction, a luxury building on the edge of a respectable neighborhood, outwardly indistinguishable from dozens of others, with a secure underground garage and discreet private elevators. The kind of place where wealthy residents could pretend that the city's uglier realities existed far below them. In his tower office, Victor listened to the collected reports with growing focus. Each detail clicked into his internal map. A professional-looking car. A panicked small-time thug. A rumor of a private safe house used by criminals who wanted comfort along with secrecy. It was enough to justify a closer look. He could have passed the address anonymously to the police, but he imagined the time it would take them to assemble a warrant, coordinate units, and plan a cautious operation. He thought again of the windowless rooms he had seen long ago and of the children who had not been found in time. He decided that, in this case, caution was a luxury Emma Hayes did not have. He rose from his chair, the decision settling over him like armor. The city outside gleamed with artificial stars. Somewhere within that brightness, in a building designed to project safety and status, a frightened girl lay on a cheap mattress, counting cracks on the ceiling and listening to the footsteps of men who saw her as leverage. Victor intended to prove them wrong. Victor's order spread through the city like a cold signal. Phones lit up in bars, side streets, and parked cars. Men who drifted between easy jobs checked weapons and jackets, then left without questions. For one night, gambling, debts, and deals were secondary. A child had been taken from his streets. That was enough. He dressed to vanish in a crowd, dark jacket, plain trousers, gloves, shoes with no shine. The powerful man in the mirror blurred into an ordinary shape that cameras would barely register. Behind his calm stare, old anger shifted, fed by memories of children left in rooms where no one came. Rocco arrived with a tablet of maps from Mira. The luxury tower unfolded as lines and marks, glass lobby with guards, concrete garage below, stacked floors above. Small symbols showed cameras, blind corners, guard routes, service doors, and locks weakened with bot codes. Hidden paths threaded behind the polished surfaces, meant for cleaners and repair crews. He traced a route with his finger: side entrance, staff corridor, freight elevator, utility hallway, target floor. Teams were assigned to that plan. One would slip in through the service level, another take positions in the underground garage, others watch street exits. No sirens, no shouting, only quiet pressure until the kidnappers had nowhere left to run. Cars rolled out from hidden garages and merged with normal traffic. Only their pattern mattered, one parked by the staff entrance, one near the ramp, another on a side street with a view of both. Drivers became lookouts, just more silhouettes in a city that ignored its own background. Inside the tower, the apartment that had seemed secure now felt thin. The muted television showed Emma's school picture again and again, her small smile paired with words about time running out. A news ticker mentioned anonymous tips and unnamed criminal sources pushing the search. Costa heard it as a threat. If someone like Victor was moving, this job had already gone wrong. At the table, his partner hunched over a laptop, reading messages from the buyer. Meetings were delayed, locations changed, excuses framed as caution. Mentions of police and publicity kept appearing. The quick plan, a fast grab, a short wait, easy money, had turned into a long risk. Every extra hour with Emma in the back room felt like another door closing. For Emma, that back room was the whole world. She lay on a thin mattress, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of dust and strangers. Her head throbbed from the drug, her skin from ropes. The bulb hummed, turning the air flat and gray. Time dissolved, so she measured it in small things: footsteps outside, the scrape of a chair, the rise and fall of tense voices in the next room. Across the city, detectives bent over whiteboards and lists. They had the alley, the backpack, rough timings, and witnesses whose memories blurred at the edges. They knew a dark car had left the scene. They had no apartment number, no names. Some sensed another hunt running ahead of theirs, pulling scraps of information faster than official channels could. Mira watched the tower from her screens. One feed showed the entrance and its board guard. Another tracked the lobby. Elevators appeared as numbers sliding up and down. The key view was a quiet corridor outside Costa's apartment, soft light, identical doors, a camera in the corner. She saw Costa step out, walk to the end of the hall, stare into nothing, then go back inside with tight shoulders. Later the partner cracked the door, peered out, and shut it quickly. Each action went to Rocco with the same conclusion: they were close to running. Victor took a private lift to his own underground garage, where the air cooled and smelled of fuel. Plane cars waited, men beside them. No one needed speeches. The fact that a 10-year-old had been dragged off the street was enough. The convoy reached the tower, split, and settled into place. Some cars stayed on the street. Others rolled down the ramp into the underground garage through a gate that opened for the right card. Inside, the space stretched in rows of pillars and parked vehicles. Shadows pooled between bumpers and concrete. Victor stepped out and found his people, a man checking his trunk, another leaning on a tool cart, a third scrolling on his phone near an exit. To strangers, they were scenery. To him, a closed circle. Rocco's voice reached him through an earpiece, carrying Myra's report. Inside the apartment, items were going into bags. Movements had turned quick and clipped. The kidnappers had decided to move the girl. If his men acted too early, they might retreat upstairs with their hostage. If they waited too long, a car would reach the street. Upstairs, Emma felt the change before she understood it. The door opened wide, spilling brighter light into the small room. Hands tightened the blanket around her and retied the knots with rough urgency. When she was lifted, the arms under her felt tense and uneven. The mattress and bare walls dropped away. The hallway outside smelled of cleaner and perfume, lined with closed doors hiding quiet lives. They carried her toward the elevator. A small camera watched from the corner. On Myra's screen, 3 shapes moved together, 2 tall forms, 1 bundled figure. In the garage below, Victor glanced at the indicator panel above a set of metal doors. One elevator that had rested on a higher floor began to descend, a pale number sliding down toward the level marked for the underground. Cables murmured behind the walls as the car sank. Inside it, fear and greed stood shoulder to shoulder around a child wrapped in fabric. Below, among the rows of silent cars, the waiting men shifted their weight and tightened their grip, every sense locked on the doors that would soon open and decide what the night became. The elevator doors parted with a soft mechanical slide and released the 3 figures into the underground garage. Cold air met them, still and dense, carrying the mixed smells of oil, dust, and old exhaust. Pale light from fluorescent strips lay in long bands across the concrete, leaving deep shadows between the rows of cars. Costa stepped out first, body taut, eyes rushing over pillars, license plates, the slow blinking of tiny red lights on cameras. The space seemed almost empty, but not in a comforting way. It felt hollowed out, as if something unseen waited just beyond the edge of his vision. His partner followed, arms wrapped around the bundled shape of Emma. The blanket muffled her, but through a small gap near her chin she watched pieces of the world slide past, the rounded curve of a tire, the chipped edge of a parking line, the long spine of a concrete pillar. The air here felt different from the stale stillness of the apartment. It was colder, wider, but just as threatening. Her heart beat fast, but exhaustion dulled its edges, turning everything into a slow, heavy thudding inside her ribs. They aimed for a dark sedan near the far wall, the kind of car designed to disappear into traffic. Its black paint drank in the weak light. There were other vehicles scattered nearby, some covered, some with dust on the windshields, all watching in their own silent way. A man in a reflective vest rolled a tool cart along one aisle, the wheels squeaking at each turn. Another figure leaned into the open trunk of a gray car, rummaging as if searching for something stubbornly hidden. A third sat in the driver's seat of a parked vehicle, head bowed, hands near his phone, posture bored. To anyone else these shapes might have looked ordinary, just scraps from the background of a city. To Costa, the arrangement struck the wrong note. The spacing, the angles, the way no one seemed surprised by the sight of two men carrying a blanket-wrapped bundle through the garage in the middle of the night, none of it felt random. Sweat gathered at his collar despite the chill. He forced himself forward, but each step landed with growing reluctance. He tried to adjust his route, shifting slightly toward another lane, keeping the car within reach but changing his angle to it. His partner's grip on Emma tightened reflexively, fingers sinking through the blanket into her thin shoulders. She felt the tremor in his arms, sensed the unsteady rhythm in his chest, and understood in a distant, detached way that the men who had frightened her were now frightened themselves. The blanket made the world small, but not small enough to exclude the pressure building around them. From the shadow of a concrete column, Victor observed the scene with the calm intensity of someone who had already decided how it should end. He measured the distance between each of his men and their targets, weighed the time it would take for a desperate hand to reach for a gun, calculated the risk of a panicked move with a child in the middle. The garage was no longer a neutral space. It had become a closed board, and the last pieces were sliding into place. A brief signal passed through the air, subtle enough to be missed by any ordinary observer. The man in the vest let his cart roll from his hands, it bumped gently against a bumper and stopped. The figure at the trunk closed it with a firm motion and stepped away, leaving the car behind. The driver in the parked vehicle straightened, pocketed his phone, and leaned against his door in a stance that no longer suggested boredom. None of them moved aggressively. They simply existed differently, as if the garage had exhaled and reshaped itself. Costa halted, chest tightening. The path to the exit no longer felt open. Every direction he looked now included at least one pair of eyes that did not slide past him. Deep in his chest, something gave way to raw fear. His hand moved toward the inside of his jacket, fingers searching for the familiar cold grip pressed against his ribs. A plan formed, more instinct than strategy, the girl as shield, the weapon as leverage, the threat of harm as his only door out. The plan never had a chance to grow. Before his fingers closed around the weapon, one of Victor's men crossed the distance between them in a sudden, controlled rush. A hand latched onto Costa's wrist and twisted it in a direction no joint wanted to go. Pain exploded up his arm, white and blinding. His fingers released the gun, sending it clattering across the concrete in a thin, scraping arc. A sharp blow to the back of his leg knocked his balance away, and he dropped hard to one knee. The partner jerked backward, dragging Emma with him. Her body jerked with the movement, breath driven from her lungs. He tightened his grip until she felt the pressure like a band around her chest. His gaze flicked between the man on the ground, the approaching figures, and the gun that slid to a stop at the feet of someone stepping calmly into view. He recognized that face from stories whispered in smoky rooms and back alleys, stories about a man whose displeasure did not end with a single punishment. Panic stripped away what little composure he had left. He pulled Emma closer, aligning her small body in front of his chest, trying to make her a barrier between himself and the closing ring. Her weight became a tool in his mind, a human obstacle he was willing to risk, because he had run out of other tools. Her heart hammered against his forearm, she could feel every ragged breath he took. The space around them shrank into a narrow circle of light and movement. Victor's gaze settled on that makeshift shield, on the way the man's arms locked around the child, on the fear and calculation tangled together in his eyes. The sight touched something older in him than business and profit, something forged years ago in different rooms with different children who had not been saved. He had drawn a line around this kind of crime and enforced it repeatedly. If that line broke here, in this garage, it would be harder to hold anywhere else. The signal he gave this time was even smaller, barely more than a shift in the set of his shoulders. Two of his men read it perfectly. They moved from different angles, not rushing in a straight line, but cutting across the man's options. One targeted the hinge of the shoulder with a fast, brutal strike that disrupted his grip without striking the girl. The other looped an arm in from behind, trapping elbows and driving them backward. The combined force tore his hold apart. Emma slipped from his arms, dropping toward the concrete. The fall jolted through her side, a bruising impact that shocked her body but did not break it. Before panic could flood her, another set of hands reached her, lifting her up with a different kind of pressure. The grip was strong but precise, fingers spreading to support her weight without crushing. The blanket settled around her shoulders again, adjusted by someone paying attention to her comfort even in this hard place. The partner lunged instinctively, reaching after her, but his movement met a quick strike to the side of his leg that sent him sprawling. In moments his wrists were forced behind his back and secured with tight plastic restraints. Costa, still on his knees, found his own arms pinned and bound in the same way. Their breathing came in harsh pulls. Defiance flickered and failed. Any sense of control they might have claimed earlier in the day had been stripped away completely. For a few seconds, the garage held a deep, unnatural quiet. No one shouted. There were no threats or boasts. The only sounds were the soft scuffs of shoes, the rustle of clothing, the distant hum of machinery, and Emma's quick, uneven breaths. The confrontation that might have erupted into gunfire and chaos had been resolved in a narrow window of controlled violence, leaving the most fragile person in the scene alive and out of immediate reach. Victor took a final measure of the situation. The girl was in his orbit now, held by one of his most steady men, partially shielded from the sight of the restrained kidnappers. The two criminals lay on the floor in uncomfortable postures, wrists tight, faces pale. His own people occupied key positions among the cars and pillars, ready for any late surprise that did not come. Paths radiated outward from this moment, a version where police arrived to find the captors in his custody, a version where they vanished with no trace, a version where the buyer behind them felt the consequences in ways that would never touch the public record. He chose a mixture that suited his purposes. The child would go back to the world of hospitals and parents and news cameras, returned by an invisible hand that did not ask for credit. The men who had taken her would go somewhere else entirely, into the deep unofficial system that his organization maintained, a web of locked doors, unregistered rooms, and individuals skilled at extracting names, numbers, and hidden connections. The city's formal justice might never see them, but their absence would still echo. The car that had brought him rolled forward, its engine humming softly. The back door opened. The man holding Emma carried her over, set her gently on the seat, and adjusted the blanket so her legs were covered and her head could rest. The interior smelled of leather and faint cleaning chemicals, warm compared to the garage. Another operative slid in beside her, chosen precisely because his presence felt less threatening than the others. He watched her, not touching, making sure she did not slump in a way that blocked her breathing. The door closed with a muted thud, sealing her into a pocket of quiet almost alien after the night's events. Outside, Costa and his partner were hauled to their feet and guided toward a different car, one with no softness in its seats and no need for comfort. Their fear had shifted now from immediate survival to a deeper dread, the kind that came when a man realized he had stepped into a circle from which people rarely returned unchanged, if they returned at all. A short while later, far from the tower and its underground garage, an unremarkable phone made a single call to emergency services. A flat, altered voice reported a girl who looked like the missing child from the news standing alone near a pedestrian crossing close to a small clinic. The caller provided precise details about clothing and approximate age, then cut the line cleanly, leaving no opening for extra questions. The car carrying Emma stopped near that crossing under the dim glow of a streetlight. The back door opened. Gentle hands guided her out and steadied her until her feet found the pavement. The blanket remained wrapped around her small frame. Her legs trembled, but the fresh air felt different from anything she had breathed since the walk home from school, cooler, open, carrying traces of trees and distant traffic. By the time she turned her head to look at the vehicle, its door had already closed. It pulled away at a measured pace, joining the flow of anonymous lights sliding through the city. Sirens arrived in rising waves, first distant, then near. Red and blue reflections flickered across shop windows and parked cars. Paramedics reached her with practiced urgency, bending to her level, checking her condition, placing careful hands on her shoulders and wrists. Their questions came in soft tones, more rhythm than meaning to her hazy mind. What mattered most was that none of these hands hurt and none of these eyes held the hungry calculation she had seen in the apartment. The world had tilted again, but this time towards safety. The hospital absorbed her into its bright, sterile corridors. Tests were run, blood drawn, bruises photographed for records. Nurses wrapped her in a different blanket, one that smelled of laundry detergent instead of concrete. Doctors spoke in measured voices about sedatives, about observation, about trauma. She answered what she could, describing an alley, a cloth over her face, a room without windows, loud footsteps and low arguments, and then a cold place filled with cars and strangers who fought each other without shouting. Her memory blurred where fear and chemicals had mixed. Eventually exhaustion pushed her into sleep on a bed that did not move and under light that did not flicker. Her parents arrived already half broken by the hours of waiting and not knowing. When they saw her breathing, saw her chest rise and fall, touched her fingers and felt them twitch in response, something inside them gave way completely. Relief and sorrow tangled together. The talk of detectives, doctors, and social workers moved around them like distant noise. For that moment, all that mattered was the warmth of her skin and the promise that she would leave this building alive. Reports and paperwork began to grow in the background. Detectives traced the anonymous call, found nothing usable, and added it to the file as one more shadowed detail. They speculated quietly about who had taken the child from her captors and placed her where official help could find her. Some suspected the involvement of criminal networks that controlled large parts of the city's unseen life. No one wrote that suspicion on the formal forms, but it colored the way they discussed the case in private. News channels shifted their tone to match the new reality. The word missing gave way to found. Commentators praised the speed of law enforcement, the vigilance of citizens, the power of shared information. Brief mentions were made of unconfirmed reports that unnamed figures from the underworld had turned against the kidnappers. Those hints were left vague, just enough to add an edge of mystery, never enough to point at any one person. In his office overlooking the grid of lights, Victor watched a late broadcast in silence. Emma appeared on the screen in a hospital photo, wrapped in a blanket, hair tangled, cheeks pale. The anchor spoke about resilience, about gratitude, about continuing investigations into the people responsible. None of the words touched the parts of the story that truly mattered to him, the moment in the garage when a man decided not to allow a child's body to be used as defense, the unspoken promise that people who trafficked in that kind of cruelty would not simply be handed over and forgotten. On his desk lay a familiar red object, dried and cleaned, a backpack with a small silver star on the zipper. Strings of favors and fears had brought it here from the evidence path that had briefly claimed it. The papers inside were wrinkled but legible, the sketchbook swollen from dried water but still full of childish animals and crooked shapes. It was a fragment of the life that had existed before the alley and the sedan. He studied it for a while, considering whether to keep it as a reminder or return it to the world it belonged to. Eventually he chose to send it back through another anonymous channel, arranging for it to appear as something found, misfiled, and finally returned. The girl might open it and see that nothing inside had truly changed, or she might feel a shiver at touching something that had traveled through places she would never visit. Either way, its journey would be complete. In unmarked rooms far from hospitals and cameras, Costa and his partner entered a darker chapter. They faced questions they could not evade and consequences they could not bargain down. Information about the buyer and any side players peeled away under pressure. Their future shrank into a set of grim possibilities. In certain corners of the city, people heard that two men who had crossed a particular boundary had vanished and understood the lesson without needing details. Morning moved across the skyline, turning the glass of towers pale gold. Streets filled with buses, cars, and children heading to school. At kitchen tables, families talked about the girl who had been taken and then found, about fear, and about the fragile relief of a good outcome. Most would never know that a man whose name they associated with danger had chosen, for his own reasons, to pull a child back from the darkest edge of his world. The city resumed its ordinary noise, carrying buried inside it one more secret night that had almost ended differently.